Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. Every night, without fail, I would sit by my window, staring at the city that didn't exist. It wasn't a dream, or at least, it didn't feel like one. There, in the distance, was a sprawling urban landscape, bathed in the cold light of street lamps. The buildings were familiar, though I had never seen them before. I could trace the winding roads, the familiar silhouette of the park, the tall, imposing tower that loomed above it all. But it wasn't on any map. It wasn't supposed to be there. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, the world around me was often a blur of tired thoughts and overstimulated senses. But as the nights passed, the city became more and more real. I could see the subtle shifts in the movement of people on the streets. Their shadows stretched out across the pavement, growing longer as the night deepened. And I could hear the hum of distant traffic, the soft clinking of a far-off bell. One evening, I decided to venture out and find this city. I had been living in my small apartment for months, and the thought of discovering something new, something real, felt like a necessary distraction. I stood up from my chair, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. The cool air of the night seeped into my skin, and I felt the gentle pulse of adrenaline. But no matter where I went the next day, no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find the city. The streets were the same ones I had walked for weeks, the park was unchanged, and the towering building I had so often gazed upon simply wasn't there. I didn't understand. Where had it gone? How could something that was so real, so vivid in my mind, just vanish overnight? It was the beginning of something that would change everything. The more I tried to find the city, the more elusive it became. It would reappear at night, in its full, cold glory, but when the sun rose, it would be gone. Each time I looked out the window, I felt a knot form in my chest. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. There was a sense of inevitability to it, as if I had already crossed some line I couldn't return from. I knew, somehow, that the city was waiting for me. And then came the first sound. It was a small, unnoticeable sound at first, a faint rustling, like a leaf brushing against the glass. I thought it was the wind. But then, the sound grew louder, sharper, more defined. It wasn't the wind. It was as if someone was standing just outside my window, just out of view. I could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. I leaned forward, straining my ears, my heart beginning to race. I told myself it was nothing. Just my mind playing tricks on me, or perhaps an animal outside. But when I looked outside, the street was empty. I thought about the city again. Maybe it wasn't a trick. Maybe it was real. Maybe it was pulling me in. I couldn't explain it, but I had to know more. The feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. Each night, I would go back to the window, hoping for answers, but only receiving more questions. It was then that I realized something else. The city was changing. Not in the way I had expected. There were no grand, sudden transformations. But if you looked closely enough, you could see it. The streets began to warp, ever so slightly, the angles of the buildings distorting in ways that defied logic. And the shadows, they became darker, deeper, stretching beyond their natural limits. And then the sounds came again, this time more distinct, more deliberate. The steps, the shuffling, and then a whisper. It wasn't clear at first, just a low murmur in the distance. But it grew louder, closer. And the whispers, well, they weren't in a language I recognized. I couldn't help myself. The draw of that city, the pull of its unknowns, was too strong to resist. I felt an overwhelming need to see it up close, to touch it, to be a part of it. But that night, when I finally gathered the courage to leave my apartment and venture into the streets, something happened. I couldn't find my way. The familiar streets twisted in ways I couldn't understand, leading me further and further from my apartment, from reality. When I looked up again, I saw it. The city. The one that never existed. But it wasn't the same anymore. The streets were empty. The buildings loomed like dark giants, their windows reflecting nothing but voids. The sky above was a sickly shade of gray, and the air felt heavy, pressing on me with every step I took. I knew then that something had changed, and I was no longer in control. The question was, would I ever be able to return? Or had I crossed some line that could never be uncrossed? The city, if I could even call it that, wasn't the same anymore. I felt the weight of its silence pressing down on me as I walked down the narrow, dimly lit streets. There were no sounds of life, no footsteps, no distant voices, just the hollow echo of my own breath. The air felt thick, like it was clinging to my skin, suffocating me with every step I took. I tried to focus on the details, the buildings, the empty roads, the dark alleyways, but nothing seemed to make sense. The shapes of the buildings were too sharp, too unnatural, as if they were carved from something otherworldly. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly was wrong, but everything felt off. I reached a familiar intersection, one I'd seen in the city through my window countless times. But now, as I stood there, the roads twisted in strange angles that didn't match what I remembered. It was as if the city was rearranging itself, changing when I wasn't looking. I shook my head, trying to clear the growing fog in my mind. There had to be an explanation for this. Maybe I was just tired, too much stress weighing down on me. But the more I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, the more the feeling of dread seeped in. It wasn't long before I realized something was watching me. At first, it was just a vague sensation, a prickling on the back of my neck. I quickened my pace, glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind me. But when I looked, the street remained empty, still as a graveyard. The sensation persisted, though, like something was just out of my sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting. My breath became shallow as I pushed forward, trying to ignore the gnawing unease. Then, a whisper. It came from behind me. Soft at first, like a breath on the wind, but then louder, sharper. It sounded like words. No, not words. It was a language I didn't recognize, a language that twisted and coiled in my mind. I couldn't understand it, but I could feel it deep in my bones. I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there. Just empty streets. I was losing my mind. I had to be. But the city, this place, felt so real. The air, the ground beneath my feet, the distant hum of something. It was all too real to be a mere figment of my imagination. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought. Maybe I was just caught in some kind of strange dream or some nightmare I couldn't escape from. But even as I tried to reason with myself, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Leave. The voice was clear now, unmistakable. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. I froze, my feet planted in place. The voice wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my head, pressing against my thoughts like an intrusive force. It was like the city itself was speaking to me, urging me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. I had to understand what this place was, why it existed, and why it seemed to be drawing me in. I took a step forward, then another, my legs trembling beneath me. The whispers followed, growing louder with every movement I made. The language, the sounds, it was as if the city itself was trying to pull me into its depths. I reached the end of the street, where an enormous archway loomed in front of me, its intricate carvings almost glowing in the faint light. The arch was an entrance to something I couldn't quite comprehend. There was no going back now. The moment I stepped through the arch, everything shifted. The air turned colder, and the street behind me seemed to fade away. I glanced back, but the road had disappeared. In its place was nothing, a vast emptiness, stretching into an unknown void. I was no longer in the city I had seen through my window. This was something else, something darker. The whispers intensified, echoing off the empty buildings around me. The sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, began to grow louder, closer. I turned, and there, at the edge of my vision, a figure stood. It was barely more than a silhouette, a shadow against the dim light. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, as if the ground was pulling me down. The whispers filled my mind, louder now, as if they were coming from inside my skull. And then, a voice I recognized, though I couldn't place it. Welcome. It was all I could hear, all I could focus on. I tried to respond, but no words came. I couldn't speak. The figure didn't move, didn't step forward, but it was there, looming over me, as if it had always been there. I didn't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually the figure began to move. Slowly at first, like a shadow in the dim light, and then faster, quicker. It was coming for me. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped. The last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was a single, chilling whisper. Stay. When I woke up, I was no longer in the place I had just seen. The city, the figure, the voices, they were gone. But the silence remained, a heavy, oppressive silence that filled every corner of the room I found myself in. I couldn't tell where I was. The walls were made of some cold, unfamiliar material, and the floor beneath me felt hard, like stone. There were no windows, no doors, just an empty, featureless space. I sat up, my body stiff and sore, and tried to make sense of what had happened. The last thing I remembered was that figure, its dark presence closing in on me. But now, everything felt wrong. The air was thick, stagnant, as though it had been trapped in this place for years. A faint hum buzzed in the background, but it was so low, so distant, that I wasn't sure if it was real or just another trick of my mind. I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I found it hard to breathe. The panic from earlier had not left me. It clung to my skin, tightened in my chest, and wrapped around my throat. I stumbled forward, my hands reaching out for something, anything that would help me make sense of my surroundings. But all I touched was the cold stone, unyielding and indifferent. The floor, the walls, they were the same, endless and empty. Was this part of the city? Was this some new layer to it, something hidden beneath the surface? My mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. Suddenly, the hum grew louder, sharper, until it filled the space completely. My teeth rattled as the sound vibrated through my bones. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside me now, rattling in my skull. And then, a voice. It was faint at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder with each passing second. The same language, the same twisted words, pouring into my mind like a flood. I didn't understand it, but I could feel it, each syllable pressing against me, suffocating me. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard another voice. It was clear this time, human, familiar. Wake up. I froze. That voice, it was mine. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. But there was no one there. The space was empty, just as it had been before. Wake up. The voice was louder now, and I realized with a shock that it wasn't coming from the room. It was inside my head. I could feel it, like a thought, a memory trying to break free. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, but the words kept coming. They echoed in my mind over and over until I could no longer separate them from my own thoughts. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. It was as if I had been trapped here for far longer than I could comprehend. But trapped by what? By the city? By the figure? Or was it something else? Something darker, deeper, that I couldn't understand? A chill ran down my spine. The fear I had tried so desperately to push away suddenly crashed over me like a wave. I was drowning in it, suffocating under its weight. The voice, my voice, whispered again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just a plea, it was a warning. Don't go back. The words reverberated in my skull, causing my head to throb with a sharp pain. I clutched my temples, but it didn't stop. The voice was louder now, mixing with the other sounds, the low hum, the strange language, until they were all one, a cacophony of whispers and commands. I tried to shake it off, to push the panic away, but the pressure was too much. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might lose consciousness again. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence returned, and with it, a terrible, suffocating stillness. I opened my eyes, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The room, or whatever this place was, had not changed. The walls were still featureless, the air still thick and heavy. But now, there was something else. A shadow. It wasn't large, but it was there, just beyond my sight, flickering at the edges of my vision. I turned, but it was gone. I blinked, and it was back. The shadow was moving, shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached out, my fingers trembling as I tried to grasp it, to touch it, but the moment my hand neared, it vanished. Like smoke slipping through my fingers. Then, from the corner of the room, I saw it. A door. I hadn't seen it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. It was just a faint outline at first, barely visible against the walls, but as I approached, it became clearer. A wooden door, weathered and worn, as if it had been here for centuries. There was something strange about it, though. A sense of rawness clung to it, like it was an invitation to something terrible. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't. But something, some force beyond my understanding, urged me forward. I reached for the handle, my hand cold and trembling. And then, as my fingers brushed the metal, the door creaked open on its own. The door creaked open, its ancient hinges groaning as if protesting against the disturbance. A gust of cold air poured through the crack, and with it came a faint smell, musty, damp, as though it had been shut for far too long. My pulse quickened. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to not cross that threshold. But my hand, almost of its own accord, pushed the door wider. Beyond the door was a hallway. The walls were covered in dark, peeling wallpaper that looked as if it had once been a rich crimson but had faded to a sickly brown over the years. The floor was covered in dust, the air thick with stagnation. I couldn't see the end of the hallway. It stretched into an endless black void, an oppressive darkness that seemed to press against me, pushing me forward. I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that made my heart skip a beat. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was nothing, no door, no escape. Just the endless hallway before me. The air was colder now, heavier, and the distant hum from before seemed to pulse around me, almost like a heartbeat. I wanted to turn back. Every part of me screamed to go back to the place I had come from, to find my way out. But deep down, I knew there was no turning back now. The city, whatever it was, had already claimed me. I started walking down the hallway, each step sending an echo that bounced off the walls. The darkness in front of me seemed to swallow up the light, leaving only the faint, flickering glow of the dim, overhead bulbs. Every now and then, I thought I saw something shift in the corners of my vision, something moving just out of sight. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. The further I went, the more I began to feel it, a presence. It wasn't the same as before, though. This time, the air wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. It felt as if something was following me, just behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. I dared not look over my shoulder. The feeling alone was enough to send a shiver crawling up my spine. And then, the whispers started again. They were faint at first, like a breeze carrying distant voices. The language was the same, a string of indecipherable words, rolling through the air like a song I didn't understand. The more I walked, the louder the voices grew, until it felt as though they were surrounding me, pressing in from every side. They felt close, like they were speaking directly to me, even though I couldn't understand a single word. I quickened my pace, my footsteps now louder in my ears. The whispers, however, grew louder still, more urgent. The voices mixed, blending together until they formed one overpowering presence. Stay. The voice was unmistakable, though it wasn't the same as before. This time, it wasn't a warning, it was a command. A demand. Stay. The air grew colder still, and I could see my breath now, fogging in front of me like the ghost of something long dead. The whispers filled my ears, and for the first time, I understood one word, one command. Turn. I froze. The voice, this time unmistakable, came from ahead of me. The hallway stretched out, its endless dark expanse reaching further than I thought possible. I had reached some kind of crossroads, an intersection, perhaps. I could feel the presence of the unseen force pressing against me. It was as if the very walls were watching me, waiting for me to make my choice. I hesitated. There were two paths now, two doors at the end of the hall, one to the left, one to the right. They were identical, save for the fact that the left door was slightly ajar, a faint, flickering light spilling out from it. The right door was shut tight, its surface smooth, undisturbed. The voices, no, The command came again, clearer now. The one word repeated in my mind like a mantra. Turn. I turned to the left. The moment I did, the air shifted, thickening around me as if some unseen weight had been lifted. The door to the left creaked open, revealing a room bathed in a sickly yellow light. It was small, almost claustrophobic, and filled with old furniture, an overturned chair, a cracked mirror, and a table covered in dust. But that wasn't what caught my attention. On the far side of the room, in the corner, was something I couldn't explain. A figure, hunched and bent, sitting motionless in the shadows. Its face was obscured, hidden behind a mask that was cracked and aged, like something you find in an old horror movie. It was still, unmoving, as if waiting. I couldn't move. I wanted to, but my feet felt glued to the floor. A part of me knew that if I stepped into that room, something would change. But another part of me, the part that had already crossed the threshold of this place, knew that I had no choice but to face whatever this was. I took a step forward. The moment I crossed the threshold of the room, the door slammed shut behind me with such force that the walls seemed to shake. I whipped around, but there was no escape. Only the figure, still sitting in the corner, its head slightly tilted as though studying me. A low, raspy voice echoed from the darkness. "Welcome." I froze. That voice, it wasn't the same as the others. It was deeper, older, like something ancient speaking from the depths of this place. The figure stood, slow and deliberate, the sound of its movement scraping against the floor like nails on a chalkboard. It took one step forward, then another, until it was just a few feet from me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, the pressure of its presence like an unshakable force. And then, just as I thought it was about to speak again, the light flickered. Once, twice. And then it went out completely. In the pitch-black darkness, the whispers returned, louder than ever. "Stay." The darkness was absolute. For a moment, I thought I had gone blind, as if my very sight had been stolen away by the suffocating shadows. The room, once so clear and defined, had vanished, leaving me in a void so black I couldn't even see my own hand in front of my face. My breath came fast, shallow, panic rising in my chest like an uncontrollable tide. The whispers were everywhere now, rushing through the air, 1,000 voices murmuring in languages I couldn't understand. The ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, like the walls of the room were closing in, bending, warping into something else entirely. Every sound, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of something moving, felt as if it were coming from all directions at once. I was no longer sure if I was standing or falling, but I felt the presence of the figure from before. Even in the pitch black, I could feel it moving, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. The weight of its gaze pressed down on me, suffocating, watching, waiting. And then, through the void, came the voice. "Do you understand?" I froze. The voice was deeper now, more resonant, as though it were coming from somewhere far beneath me. It wasn't just in my ears, it was inside my mind, reverberating through every thought, every memory, until it felt as though I couldn't separate the voice from my own voice. "Do you understand why you're here?" I tried to speak, to answer, but my mouth felt dry. No words came. I wasn't even sure if I could speak anymore. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. "Everything you've seen," the voice continued, slower now, each word dragging like the toll of a bell, "was never meant for you." Suddenly, the shadows shifted again. This time, I could make out something in the distance, an outline, faint and wraith-like. It was the figure from before, but now it was clearer. Its form, though still shadowed, seemed to pulse, an ever-changing shape that defied all logic. And then it moved, faster than before, until it was right in front of me. I took a step back, but the space seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. My breath caught in my throat as the figure leaned closer, its form now fully tangible, its presence overwhelming. "You should have stayed away," it whispered, its voice coming from everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." I tried to speak, to beg for answers, but again, nothing came. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to escape. The presence of the figure consumed me, filling every corner of my mind with the weight of its words. "Reality is a fragile thing," it murmured, as if to itself. "One wrong turn, and it can shatter. And you've shattered it." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape the suffocating grip of the figure, but I couldn't. I felt like I was drowning, trapped in an endless abyss with no way out. My thoughts were clouded, distorted, and I no longer knew if what I was experiencing was real, or if it was simply another layer of this twisted reality that had become my prison. The figure's form began to dissipate, melting into the shadows as though it were never truly there. The darkness, too, seemed to shift, swirling around me, folding in on itself. I could feel the weight of it all, crushing me, the pressure building until it was unbearable. And then, everything went still. The whispers stopped. The darkness receded. The weight lifted. For a brief moment, I felt as though I was floating, suspended in the air, as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart, leaving me suspended in a state between worlds. I blinked. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the room I had started in. The cold, empty room with no door, no windows, just a suffocating silence. The walls were still featureless, the air still thick with the same heavy stillness. But something had changed. I could feel it. The city, whatever it was, had stopped trying to reach me. The air was no longer thick with whispers. The figure was gone. The space felt empty, hollow, like the absence of something that had once been there. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore, the door. The door that had never been there before. It stood in front of me, solid, real, and untouched by the shadows. I hadn't seen it when I first entered the room, but now, there it was, waiting. It wasn't the same as the one I had opened before. This door was solid, unyielding, and from behind it, I could hear a faint sound, a sound like footsteps, moving closer. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what lay behind it. But as I stood there, staring at the door, I realized something that chilled me to my core. I had no choice. Whatever this place was, whatever force had trapped me here, I was no longer in control. This city, this nightmare, had a will of its own. And it was drawing me in, pulling me toward the door. I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers touched it, the world around me seemed to distort, bending and warping like a reflection in broken glass. The room, the walls, the door, it all shimmered, flickered like a dying light bulb. And then it stopped. The door creaked open. Beyond it, there was nothing. Just darkness. I stepped forward. Have you ever felt the chill of something out of place? Something that doesn't belong, but it's there, just waiting for you to find it? I wasn't supposed to be in that forest. I had taken the wrong turn on an old back road, chasing the idea of getting away for a while. No map, no GPS, just the road ahead. The forest around me was thick, the trees towering, their branches knotted together like a maze that blocked out most of the sun. It felt peaceful at first, but there was something strange about it. The air was heavy, and the further I went in, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. Like something was out there, hidden in the shadows of the trees, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. I didn't know how long I had been driving, but I could tell I was deep into the woods. The road had narrowed, and the gravel was beginning to give way to uneven patches of dirt. My car bounced, the tires kicking up dust behind me, and all I could hear was the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustling in the bushes off to my right. It was a perfect setting for a quiet getaway, except for the feeling that something was wrong, that something I couldn't see was keeping track of my every move. Then I saw it. It was barely visible at first, just a dark shape through the trees. But as I drove closer, it became clear, an old car. Completely out of place, parked in the middle of the forest like a relic from a forgotten time. There it sat, alone, abandoned, its body rusted and worn, but the most unsettling part of it was that it didn't seem to fit the environment. Everything around it was wild, untamed, but the car, it was almost too still. As though it had been waiting for me. I slowed down, my curiosity pulling me in. There was no reason for a car to be out here, not in the middle of nowhere. I parked my own car a little further up the road, leaving the engine running as I stepped out. The air was colder here, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I didn't know why, but I felt uneasy as I approached the abandoned vehicle. The car wasn't just old, it was almost ancient. The model was something I couldn't place, but it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The paint was faded and cracked, the chrome was dull, and the tires had sunk slightly into the ground, but the strangest part was the engine. There were no signs of rust or corrosion. It was as if it had been left there only yesterday. There was no logical explanation for it. I was alone in the woods, miles from the nearest road, and yet here was a car that looked like it hadn't been driven in decades. I circled around it, my boots crunching on the dry leaves beneath me. I wanted to touch it, to get a closer look, but something held me back. The air around the car felt thick, like it was charged with something that didn't belong. I leaned in closer, and that's when I heard it, the faintest hum. It was so soft at first that I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. The sound was coming from the engine. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart beginning to race. The car, there was something wrong about it. Something wasn't right. The engine hummed steadily, as though it were alive, as though it were waiting for something. And then, as if it had been waiting for me to make my move, the car's headlights flickered to life. I froze. The light was sharp and bright, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The hum from the engine grew louder, more insistent, like the car was somehow alive. I stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. The sound, the pulsing, mechanical hum, wasn't natural. It wasn't just a car running, it was like it had a heartbeat of its own. I couldn't pull myself away. I was drawn to it, the strange force pulling me closer. I told myself to leave, to get back in my car and drive away, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. The headlights blinked again, and before I could even think about moving, the car's door slowly creaked open. I stared at it, wide-eyed, frozen in place. The seat was empty, the space inviting me in. Something whispered in the back of my mind, telling me to get in. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the eerie hum, or the way the headlights seemed to beckon me closer. Maybe it was just my curiosity getting the better of me, but I found myself walking toward the open door, reaching for the handle without thinking. My hand closed around it, and the moment I pulled the door open fully, I heard the sound of the engine revving. Not in the way a car would when you start it up, but like a growl, like something sentient. The seat was old, worn from years of neglect, but it was warm. The car felt strangely inviting, like it wanted me to sit in it. Against every instinct screaming at me to turn and run, I slid into the driver's seat. The moment I sat down, the car jerked forward. I wasn't even sure if I had pressed the gas. The wheel moved with an eerie precision, turning as though someone, or something, was driving for me. The engine roared to life, and the tires spun, pulling me deeper into the forest. The steering wheel turned on its own, guiding me through the narrow path. I tried to stop it, to slam the brakes or shift into park, but my hands wouldn't move. The car wasn't giving me a choice. It was in control. The road ahead twisted and turned, trees lining either side, their dark forms like sentinels watching my every move. I couldn't escape. The car moved as if it knew exactly where it was going, as though it had a destination in mind. And I was helpless, trapped in the grip of something far beyond my understanding. And then, I saw something in the distance. A figure. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but as we got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a person, or at least, it looked like one. Standing still, in the middle of the road, staring directly at me. The figure was impossibly still, as if waiting. The car didn't slow down. The car didn't slow down. My heart hammered in my chest as the figure came closer, growing larger in the headlights. I could see the details now, the dark clothing, the pale skin, and the eyes, wide, unblinking, fixed directly on me. It was like they were staring into my soul, watching my every movement. The car wasn't giving me a choice. The engine roared, and the steering wheel twisted in my hands, guiding the car directly toward the figure. I tried to slam my foot on the brakes, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if something else was in control. I yanked the wheel hard to the left, desperate to avoid the person in the road, but the car swerved back on its own, forcing me back on track. The figure didn't move. It was as if it was waiting for the inevitable. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back, and I was paralyzed with fear. The car was speeding up, the trees blurring past in flashes of black and green. The figure was still standing in the middle of the road, its eyes never leaving mine. It was like we were both locked in some kind of strange, unbreakable bond. The car had made its decision, and I was just along for the ride. The moment of impact never came. I thought I would hit them. There was no way the car could stop in time, but suddenly, as if by some unseen force, the figure was gone. Vanished. I slammed my foot on the brake. The car lurched to a stop, the tires screeching against the gravel. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my pulse racing. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The forest around me was still. No more figures. No more sounds, just the wind rustling through the trees. The air felt colder now, much colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Everything was eerily silent, save for the hum of the engine. I looked around, trying to figure out where I was. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. I was no longer sure which direction I had come from or how far I had traveled. The car had taken me so deep into the forest that I couldn't even see the road anymore. There was no way back. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, like a voice calling out to me from the darkness. It was soft, barely audible over the sound of the engine. But it was there. A voice that felt like it was right behind me. Turn around. I froze. The voice came again, louder this time, filled with urgency. Turn around. It's not over. I looked in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was empty, just the same dark stretch of trees I had passed through moments ago. But something was wrong. The reflection in the mirror didn't match what was outside the car. The road behind me was distorted. It twisted unnaturally, bending in ways that didn't make sense. I blinked. The mirror returned to normal, but the feeling of being watched never left. I could sense something out there in the woods, something waiting, something just beyond the trees. A sudden thud came from the back of the car. I jerked my head around, but saw nothing. Another thud. And then a scraping sound, like something dragging along the trunk. My breath caught in my throat. The car moved again, without my control. It started forward, slower now, as if the engine was deciding where to go. The sound of something dragging against the metal grew louder. My hands were frozen on the wheel, unable to move as the car inched forward, the sound of scraping continuing. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my throat felt tight. Panic was setting in, creeping through every fiber of my being. I was completely alone, trapped in this car, and whatever was out there wasn't done with me. The scraping stopped suddenly. The car jolted, and I almost lost my grip on the wheel. The headlights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the road ahead. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just off to the side of the road, half hidden in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details at first, just a silhouette against the trees. But as the car crept closer, the figure became clearer. It was the same person from before, the one who had stood in the road, watching me. But now, something was different. The eyes, once unblinking and cold, were wide open, staring at me with a twisted intensity. And the figure wasn't standing still anymore. It was moving toward the car, slowly, almost as if it were gliding, its feet not quite touching the ground. I tried to look away, to keep my eyes on the road, but the car wouldn't let me. It pulled me toward the figure, inch by inch, as though it had a will of its own. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't stop it. The car was taking me toward that thing, and I had no choice but to go along for the ride. As the figure came closer, I could hear a soft sound, almost like a whisper, carried on the wind. It was low, unintelligible, but I could feel the weight of the words pressing down on me, suffocating me. I had to get out of the car. I had to escape. But when I reached for the door handle, my hand wouldn't move. It was as if something invisible was holding me in place. The car didn't stop. It didn't give me a chance to escape. The figure reached the side of the car, its face now fully visible in the glow of the headlights. It was a face I didn't recognize, but there was something chillingly familiar about it, something that made my skin crawl. The eyes, those eyes, were the last thing I saw before everything went dark. I woke up with a jolt, my body tense and my breath shallow. The car was still moving, gliding forward on its own, but the world outside was different. It wasn't the forest anymore. The trees were gone, replaced by barren fields stretching endlessly in all directions, the ground cracked and dry, like the land had been abandoned for decades. I didn't know how long I had been out. Time felt twisted, like it had stopped making sense the moment I sat in this cursed car. My head ached, and I struggled to sit up, the seat beneath me creaking under my weight. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound in the car, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone, that this machine, this car, had a mind of its own. The headlights flickered briefly before shining steadily ahead. I looked at the rearview mirror again, but this time the reflection wasn't right. The road behind me was gone. There was nothing. Just a dark void stretching endlessly, no sign of the forest, no sign of the road I had traveled down. I turned my head, my throat tight, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no escape. The car was still in control, and I had no idea where it was taking me. I tried to reach for the wheel, to force it to turn, but my hands wouldn't move. It was as if my body had become disconnected from my mind, like the car had sealed me in, controlling me like a puppet on a string. The figure from before, it was still haunting my thoughts. Its eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, staring at me, following me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting for me to make my move. I didn't know what it wanted, but I felt its presence everywhere. It was as though it was a part of the car, a part of the journey, a part of me. I turned my gaze back to the road, the barren fields stretching out ahead. It felt like I was moving through a dream, a place that wasn't real, but it was real enough to feel suffocating. The hum of the engine had changed, become deeper, darker, like it was alive. The car wasn't just driving, it was breathing. Suddenly, the car slowed. I hadn't pressed the brakes, but the car was coming to a stop on its own. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around. The field was gone, replaced by an old, crumbling road leading into a dark, looming building. It looked like a house, but twisted and distorted, like a nightmare frozen in time. The windows were dark, the structure sagging under years of neglect. The air was thick with something foul, like decay and rot. I didn't want to stop. I didn't want to go near that place, but the car wasn't asking me. It wasn't giving me any choice. It turned slowly, as though it had been here before, and began to roll toward the building. The ground beneath the tires was rough, the gravel crunching loudly, echoing through the silence. The sound made my stomach churn, my palms clammy as I gripped the seat, my body trembling. The closer we got, the more I could feel it, the suffocating weight of the place. It pressed down on me, the air heavy with something unnatural. I couldn't explain it, but the building felt like it was watching me, like it was aware of my presence, waiting for me to arrive. The car came to a complete stop in front of the building, and I knew without a doubt that this was where it wanted me to go. I had no control. I couldn't get out of the car, couldn't run. The door, though unlocked, refused to open. I yanked the handle, but nothing happened. It was as though the car itself had sealed me inside. A sound came from the building. A creaking, like old wood groaning under pressure. I turned my head to see the door of the house slowly opening, inch by inch. No one was there, yet the door moved as though something inside had pushed it open, inviting me in. I could feel the eyes of the figure on me, its presence somehow seeping through the walls of the car, surrounding me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. And then I heard that whisper again. Soft at first, then louder, growing in urgency. Get out. I was shaking now, my entire body rigid, frozen in place. The car's hum was louder, like it was urging me to listen, to obey. The door of the building was wide open now, the darkness inside more oppressive than I could ever have imagined. Without thinking, I unbuckled my seatbelt. My body moved against my will, as if the car had made the decision for me. I reached for the door handle again. This time, it opened. I stepped out into the cold, the air biting at my skin. The ground beneath me was uneven, the gravel crunched underfoot as I made my way toward the building, each step feeling like a mistake, each breath shallow and heavy in my chest. The door of the house was wide open, a gaping mouth calling me in. I didn't want to go inside. Every part of me screamed to turn around, to run, to get back in the car and drive far away from this place. But the car, it wouldn't let me leave. It wouldn't stop. I took one last look at the car, the headlights casting long shadows across the ground. And then I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me. The air inside the house was thick with dust and decay. The smell hit me immediately, sharp and suffocating, like rotting wood and something else, something foul that I couldn't quite identify. My eyes watered as I stepped further into the darkness, my footsteps echoing against the cold wooden floorboards. The door behind me slammed shut with a heavy thud, and I turned quickly, half expecting it to open again. But it didn't. It was locked. I was trapped. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing the cold metal of my phone. I pulled it out, hoping for some sign of life, some way to contact the outside world, but the screen stayed dark, unresponsive. The battery was dead, no surprise. I hadn't been able to charge it since I'd left the city. The car had taken me too far out. A flash of movement caught my eye. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there, just the empty, dimly lit hallway stretching before me. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, exposing the rotten wood beneath. The air felt colder here, the temperature dropping the deeper I went into the house. There were no windows. No signs of life. No sign of anyone. I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't supposed to be here. That somehow, I had walked into a place that didn't belong in this world. A place that had been left behind, forgotten by time. The whisper came again, soft and insistent, like a breath against my ear. You shouldn't have come. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The voice was so close, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It wasn't just in my head. I could feel it, feel the words pressing against me, like invisible fingers brushing against my skin. You're here now. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the house. The air felt heavier, thicker. The walls seemed to close in around me. I tried to move, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place, as though the floor had turned to quicksand. My pulse quickened as I struggled to breathe. I had to get out of here. I had to leave. I took a step forward, my legs trembling with the effort. The house groaned under my weight, the walls creaking as if the building itself was alive, watching me. The whisper came again, louder this time. It's already too late. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I wasn't alone. Something was in here with me. Something that had been waiting, watching. The air was so still, so quiet, that I almost didn't notice the footsteps behind me. Soft at first, just a faint tap, 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 but then they grew louder, closer. I turned around quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Nothing. But the footsteps continued. I had no choice. I ran. The hallway stretched before me, an endless corridor of shadows and dust. My footsteps were loud, thundering against the floor, but the footsteps behind me were louder, faster. Whoever, or whatever, was following me was getting closer. I could feel it, feel the cold breath against the back of my neck as if something were right behind me, just inches away. I reached the end of the hallway and turned a corner, desperate for an escape, but the moment I did, I collided with something solid. A wall. No door. Just a dead end. I turned around, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. That maybe Just maybe I had outrun whatever was chasing me. But then the silence was broken, not by footsteps, but by a low, guttural growl. My blood ran cold. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. But the growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the floor. I backed up, my hands searching frantically for anything I could use as a weapon, but there was nothing. Just the cold, rotting wood beneath my feet. And then, from the shadows, it appeared. The figure, it stepped into the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and twisted, bent in unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was nothing but a hollow, gaping mouth, with dark, endless eyes that seemed to swallow the light. The growl came from deep within its chest, a sound that sent chills straight down my spine. It stepped forward, its feet dragging across the floor like it was too heavy for the world to bear. The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting with every step it took toward me. I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place, my body refusing to obey my commands. The thing reached out, its long, skeletal fingers stretching toward me. Its touch was icy, and the moment its hand made contact with my skin, a sharp, searing pain shot through me as though something was pulling at my soul. I screamed, but no sound escaped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The pain was overwhelming, consuming me, and I knew that if I didn't get out, I wouldn't survive. The figure's grip tightened, and I forced myself to move. My body screamed in protest, but I twisted free, stumbling backward into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to escape. I ran blindly through the halls, the sound of the creature's growls echoing in my ears. The house seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in on me with each step I took. I had no idea where I was, or what I was running from. I just knew I had to keep moving. And then, I heard it. The engine. The car. It was there. I didn't know how or why, but it was waiting for me, parked at the end of the hallway, its headlights shining in the darkness. The car was my only chance. I ran toward it, my legs aching, my breath ragged. The creature was behind me now, its growls growing louder, closer. I reached the car, but the door wouldn't open. I yanked on the handle, but it was locked. I pounded on the window, desperation rising in my chest. Please, I thought. Please let me in. The engine roared to life, and the door clicked open. I didn't hesitate. I jumped inside, slamming the door behind me. The car began to move, slowly at first, but then faster, the engine growling as if it were eager to get away. The creature's growl faded into the distance, and I realized, with a sense of horror, that I wasn't in control of the car anymore. It was the car that was controlling me. The car sped through the dark, its headlights cutting through the night like a knife. I was no longer in control. The wheel turned by itself, the engine growling like an animal as the vehicle swerved between twisted, abandoned roads. The world outside seemed to blur, a nightmare of shadows and distorted shapes. I couldn't make sense of it. It was like I was moving through a dream, or worse, a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I glanced around, trying to find something familiar, anything that would tell me where I was, but the landscape was strange and unfamiliar. The road stretched on forever, endless and featureless, as though the world itself had been drained of meaning. The car didn't stop. It never slowed down. It was pulling me, dragging me along, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. I was a passenger in my own body, trapped inside this machine that had taken on a life of its own. I tried to open the door again, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I slammed my fist against the window in frustration, but the glass remained unyielding. I looked out into the darkness, trying to gather my thoughts. The whispering had stopped, but the presence, that cold, suffocating presence, was still with me. It was as though something was watching me from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pulled towards something, a destination that I had no control over, a place that I didn't want to reach. And then, I saw it. In the distance, up ahead, there was a faint glow, a light. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but as the car drew closer, the light grew brighter, sharper, and I realized it was a building. A house. The same twisted, decaying structure from before. It was impossible. There was no way this place could be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the mind, but the closer I got, the more real it seemed. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and empty, the door wide open, waiting for me. The car didn't stop. It drove straight toward the building, and I knew, in that moment, that I had no choice but to follow it. The car was guiding me, pulling me back to this place, this house. The place that had started it all. I fought against it, tried to grab the wheel, to steer the car away, but it was useless. The car was too powerful, too relentless. I was nothing more than a passenger now, carried along by its will, a prisoner of the road. The engine roared louder, a terrifying sound that filled my ears, drowning out everything else. The house was only a few feet away now, the car moving faster, its headlights shining into the dark interior. The door was open, the same cold invitation to step inside. And then, just as the car was about to crash into the house, everything stopped. The car jolted to a sudden halt, its engine sputtering and dying, the lights flickering. I was thrown forward, my head slamming against the dashboard, but there was no pain. I was numb, detached from everything. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I looked up. The house stood before me, silent and still, its door wide open, waiting. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only stare at the house, at the place that had trapped me, at the place that had led me here. It was like I had come full circle, like this was the end of the road, the end of everything. I stepped out of the car, my legs weak, my mind spinning. I didn't want to go inside, but I knew I had no choice. Something inside the house was waiting for me. Something that had been waiting for a long time. The door creaked as I stepped inside, the sound echoing in the emptiness. The air was thick with dust and decay, the same foul stench from before. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, feel the presence that had been following me all this time. The house was alive. I could feel it in the walls, in the floor beneath my feet. It was like the building was breathing, shifting, changing. It was no longer just a structure, it was something more. It was a part of me now, a part of my journey, my fate. And then, I saw it. In the center of the room, standing in the dark, was the figure. The same twisted creature, the one that had been haunting me since the moment I first got into the car. Its hollow eyes fixed on me, its mouth open in a silent scream. It wasn't alone anymore. There were more. Shadows, shapes moving around the room, flickering in and out of existence, like they were part of the house itself. They circled around me, closing in, and I realized, with a sickening certainty, that they were waiting. They were waiting for me to make the final move. I couldn't run. I couldn't escape. The house had trapped me here, the car had driven me here, and now it was up to me to decide what came next. I took a step forward, my body moving on its own, my mind numb. The creature's eyes followed me, unblinking, its hollow gaze boring into my soul. It was waiting for me to join it, to become a part of the house, to become a part of whatever this place was. And then I understood. This was it. The end. I was never going to leave this place. The car had taken me here for a reason. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a prison. A prison that I couldn't escape. A prison that had been waiting for me all along. I was never going to see the outside world again. And as I stepped forward, the shadows swallowed me whole. Have you ever woken up and felt like the world around you wasn't real? Like something had shifted and you were standing on the edge of something unknown? I've had that feeling for as long as I can remember, ever since I started having the same dream every night. The same one. Over and over. It always begins the same way. I'm standing in the middle of a busy city. The sky is clear, the sun is shining, and everything feels ordinary, even though I know deep down that it's not. There's a subtle sense of unease in the air, something just on the edge of my awareness, but I can never quite grasp it. The people around me walk by, unaware, but I know that something is wrong. The world is on the edge of something terrible. And then it happens. The ground shakes beneath my feet, and I look up, my heart racing. A massive explosion rips through the air, sending buildings crumbling and people screaming. The world falls into chaos, and I can do nothing but watch as the destruction unfolds around me. It's like I'm frozen in time, unable to move, unable to help. The dream always ends the same way, me, standing alone amidst the ruins, surrounded by smoke and debris, the sound of distant sirens ringing in my ears. Every time I wake up, it's the same. I can still feel the shock in my bones, the fear in my chest. I tell myself it's just a dream, that it's not real, but somehow, I can't shake the feeling that it's more than that. It's as though it's something I've seen before, something that's waiting to happen. The strangest part? The dream never changes. Every night, it's the same, down to the last detail. The same city, the same explosion, the same aftermath. And every morning, I wake up, and it feels like nothing has changed. Like it was just a figment of my imagination. Until last night. I woke up in the usual way, sweat on my brow, my heart still racing from the nightmare. But this time, when I looked out the window, I saw something that shouldn't have been there. The sky was different, dark clouds had rolled in, and the air felt thick, heavy, like something was about to happen. It was like the dream had bled into reality, seeping into my waking life. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a coincidence. But as the day went on, I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The world around me felt off. People walked by, oblivious to the weight in the air, but I couldn't ignore it. The ground seemed to hum beneath my feet, like something was waiting just below the surface. As the day wore on, I found myself watching the news more and more, hoping for some kind of explanation. The stories were the usual: traffic reports, weather updates, the usual noise that fills the air. But then, something caught my attention. There was a report about a building collapse. A massive explosion in the city center. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The details, they were the same. The exact same as the dream. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was I seeing things? Or was something much worse at play here? I couldn't deny what I'd seen. The dream and reality, they were colliding, merging in a way that didn't make sense. But there was no mistaking it. What I had dreamed was happening right in front of me. And then it happened again. The news broadcast cut to footage of the explosion, the exact same one I'd seen in my dream. People were running, buildings were crumbling, and the chaos was unfolding right before my eyes. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched in horror. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just a dream. It was real. I tried to tell myself that it was just a random event, that it had no connection to my dreams, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow connected to it all. As though I was being pulled towards something, toward the disaster I had seen in my sleep. And then, as the sun began to set, I felt it, a cold chill in the air, a sensation that washed over me like a wave. It was the same feeling I had in the dream right before the explosion. The same feeling that something terrible was about to happen. I looked out the window, watching the sky darken, and I realized something terrifying. It was coming. The nightmare. It was coming to life, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The night was restless. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside felt amplified, like the world was alive and watching me. Sleep was impossible. My mind was racing, replaying the events of the day over and over again. The dream, the explosion, the news report, it all felt too connected to be a coincidence. I sat by the window, staring out into the darkness. The street below was empty, save for the occasional flicker of a streetlight. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though something was pressing down on the world. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I saw no one. And then I saw it. A faint glow on the horizon, barely visible but unmistakable. It was the same eerie light from my dream, the one that came right before the disaster struck. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it pulse, growing brighter and dimmer in a slow, rhythmic pattern. It was almost hypnotic, drawing me in, but at the same time, it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I grabbed my phone and tried to find news updates, hoping for an explanation, but there was nothing. The world seemed oblivious to what I was seeing. Or maybe it wasn't happening for anyone else. Maybe this was just for me. That thought terrified me more than anything. I decided I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. I needed answers. If the dream was bleeding into reality, if the events I was seeing were connected, then I had to find out why. The first step was figuring out where that glow was coming from. I grabbed a flashlight and my jacket and headed out into the night. The air was colder than I expected, biting against my skin as I made my way down the empty street. The glow on the horizon seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, guiding me like a beacon. As I walked, the neighborhood around me grew eerily quiet. No dogs barking, no distant hum of cars, just silence. It was as though the world had been muted. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud against the pavement, each one echoing in the stillness. The further I went, the stranger things became. The streetlights flickered as I passed, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move on their own. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickened my pace, refusing to look back. Finally, I reached the edge of the neighborhood, where the houses gave way to an open field. The glow was brighter now, emanating from somewhere just beyond the tree line. My heart pounded as I stepped into the field, the tall grass brushing against my legs. That's when I heard it, a low hum, almost like a vibration, coming from the direction of the glow. It wasn't loud, but it was deep, resonating in my chest like the rumble of distant thunder. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I scanned the trees ahead. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, only the hum growing louder. I took a deep breath and pressed forward, my legs feeling like lead. The glow grew brighter with each step, and the hum seemed to fill the air, surrounding me. By the time I reached the tree line, it was almost deafening. I hesitated, staring into the darkness between the trees. The glow was just beyond, casting faint shadows against the trunks. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run as fast as I could, but something compelled me to keep going. As I stepped into the trees, the hum abruptly stopped. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, that it felt like the world had been swallowed whole. My ears rang in the absence of sound, and my breathing seemed unnaturally loud. And then I saw it. In the center of the clearing ahead, there was a massive crater. The glow was coming from within, pulsing like a heartbeat. The edges of the crater were jagged, as though something had exploded there, but there was no debris, no signs of destruction. Just the light, radiating from deep within. I moved closer, my steps slow and hesitant. The light seemed to shift and shimmer, almost alive, and as I stood at the edge of the crater, I felt a strange pull. It was as though the light was reaching out to me, drawing me in. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to reach out, to touch it. My hand trembled as I extended it toward the glow, the warmth of the light brushing against my skin. And then everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer standing by the crater. Instead, I was lying on the ground, surrounded by a dense mist. The air was cold and damp, and the world around me was eerily silent. My head throbbed, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I had gotten there. Then the memories came rushing back, the glow, the crater, the pull. I sat up quickly, my heart racing, but the crater was gone. The clearing was empty, just an expanse of dry earth surrounded by the same lifeless trees. Panic set in. How long had I been unconscious? What had happened to the glow? I checked my phone, but the screen was black, unresponsive. The world felt wrong, as though I had stepped into a place where time and reality no longer followed the rules I knew. I stood and tried to orient myself, but the mist made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The trees loomed like shadowy figures, their twisted branches reaching toward me. I took a deep breath and began walking, hoping to find the edge of the forest, but every step felt like I was moving deeper into a maze. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint crunch of leaves under my feet. But then, faintly at first, I began to hear something, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap. 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 It came from somewhere in the mist, steady and deliberate. My pulse quickened as I strained to locate the source, but the sound seemed to move, circling me like a predator. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the fog. The tapping stopped. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The silence stretched on, unbearable, until a new sound emerged, a low, guttural whisper, just behind me. "Why did you come here?" I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just mist and shadows. My breath came in short gasps, and I fought the urge to run. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The whisper came again, closer this time. "You shouldn't have touched it." The ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I stumbled, catching myself against a tree. The bark was cold and wet, and when I pulled my hand away, it was stained with something dark. Blood. I recoiled, wiping my hand on my jacket, and backed away. The mist seemed to thicken, closing in around me, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping into a chaotic chorus. You saw it. You brought it back. It's too late now. The words made no sense, but their tone was unmistakable, accusatory, filled with anger and despair. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, drilling into my mind. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, I thought I was alone again. But then I saw it, a figure emerging from the mist, its outline barely visible. It was humanoid but wrong, its proportions distorted, its movements jerky and unnatural. Stay back. I shouted, but the figure kept coming. My instincts took over, and I turned and ran, the world around me a blur of gray and shadow. The sound of footsteps followed, heavy and relentless, and I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning with the effort. Finally, I burst out of the forest and into an open field. The mist thinned here, and I could see the faint outline of buildings in the distance. A wave of relief washed over me. I was back in the real world. Or so I thought. As I approached the buildings, I realized something was wrong. The streets were deserted, the windows dark. Cars sat abandoned, their doors hanging open. It was as if the town had been frozen in the middle of an evacuation. I slowed to a walk, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and surveyed the area. The glow from the crater was gone, but its effects lingered. The air felt heavy, charged with an invisible energy that made my skin crawl. And then I saw the first sign that something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. A newspaper lay on the ground, its pages fluttering in the breeze. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and read the date. It was 5 days into the future. I stared at the newspaper, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The date was impossible, yet it was there, printed in bold black letters. 5 days ahead. How could I have lost that much time? My hands shook as I flipped through the pages, searching for answers. The headlines were chilling, reports of mysterious disappearances, strange phenomena, and growing unrest. The word unexplained appeared over and over again, each instant sinking deeper into my chest like a weight. But one article stopped me cold. A photo accompanied it, blurry but unmistakable. It was me, standing at the edge of the crater, my face pale and wide-eyed. The headline read, "Witness to the unknown, local resident claims to have seen the source." My legs gave out, and I sank to the ground, the newspaper crumpling in my grip. I wasn't just a witness, I had touched the glow, felt its pull. And now it seemed the world was unraveling around me, the lines between dream and reality blurred beyond recognition. I needed answers. And I needed them now. I stood, shoving the newspaper into my jacket pocket, and scanned the deserted town. There had to be someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. I moved toward the nearest building, an old diner with its door slightly ajar. Inside, the place was eerily still. Plates and cups sat on tables as though the diners had simply vanished mid-meal. The faint smell of stale coffee hung in the air, and the jukebox in the corner emitted a soft hum, though no music played. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the empty space. No response. I approached the counter, my footsteps loud against the tiled floor. A newspaper lay open next to a half-empty cup of coffee. This one was dated today, or at least what should have been today. The headline was worse than anything I'd seen so far. Reality fractures continue, global crisis deepens. The article described bizarre phenomena occurring all over the world, cities appearing and disappearing, people reporting memories of events that never happened, time itself seeming to loop and fragment. Scientists were at a loss, and panic was spreading. I stumbled back, my breath hitching. This was bigger than me, bigger than the crater. Whatever I had seen, whatever I had touched, it was spreading. The sound of glass shattering snapped me on my thoughts. I spun around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The diner was empty, yet the air felt charged, alive with an unseen presence. And then I heard the voice again. You shouldn't have touched it. It came from everywhere and nowhere, deep and resonant, vibrating through the very fabric of the room. Who are you? I shouted, my voice cracking. What do you want from me? The room seemed to shift, the walls bending and warping like the surface of a rippling pond. Shadows danced across the floor, growing taller and more defined. We are what remains, the voice said, its tone filled with sorrow. You opened the door. Now it cannot be closed. I didn't mean to. I pleaded, backing away toward the exit. I didn't know. You knew. The word cut through me like a blade, sharp and accusatory. You saw the warnings, and still, you reached out. The shadows converged, forming a shape, humanoid but distorted, its features shifting and melting like wax. It stepped toward me, and I felt an overwhelming pressure, as though the air itself was trying to crush me. Fix it, the figure said, or let it consume everything. Before I could respond, the figure lunged. I screamed, throwing up my arms to shield myself, but instead of impact, I felt a rush of cold air. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the field, standing at the edge of the crater. The glow was gone, replaced by a faint, smoldering darkness. The hum had returned, quieter now, like the last echoes of a fading song. I fell to my knees, my body trembling. The weight of the voice's words pressed down on me. Fix it. But how? I was just one person, lost in a nightmare that had spilled into the waking world. As I sat there, staring into the abyss of the crater, a realization struck me. The dreams, the visions, they weren't warnings. They were instructions. The answer was in the dreams. The dreams had always been vivid, but now I understood they weren't just glimpses of another reality. They were guiding me, forcing me to see what needed to be done. My mind raced as I pieced together fragments of each dream, the patterns in the glow, the hum, the overwhelming sense of being pulled towards something greater. The crater was the key. I stood at the edge, the dark, smoldering pit stretching endlessly below me. The hum resonated through my chest, faint but insistent, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of my heart. This is where it started, I murmured, my voice barely audible over the sound. And this is where it ends. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the strange shard I had taken from the glow during that first night. It felt warm against my palm, pulsing faintly, as if alive. The shard had been with me all along, its presence tying me to the fractures in reality. The hum grew louder as I held the shard closer to the crater. The air thickened, and the ground beneath me began to tremble. I took a deep breath, my mind flooded with the voice's warning, fix it, or let it consume everything. Fix it, I whispered, gripping the shard tightly. Without thinking, I stepped forward, plunging into the crater. The fall was endless, the darkness around me broken only by flashes of light, fragments of memories, both mine and those of people I didn't recognize. I saw the faces of strangers, their expressions frozen in fear and confusion. I saw cities crumbling, skies torn apart by jagged streaks of energy. And then, I saw myself. I was standing in the field, my hand outstretched toward the glow. But something was different. This version of me hesitated, pulling back before the glow could consume them. The image flickered, replaced by another, a version of me walking away from the crater, leaving it untouched. The visions multiplied, showing countless versions of myself, each making a different choice. I realized then that this wasn't just about me. It was about every possible me, every decision I had ever made. The hum grew deafening, and I felt the shard in my hand vibrate violently. A sharp pain shot through my body, and I screamed, the sound swallowed by the void around me. Choose, the voice boomed, echoing from every direction. I didn't understand. Choose what? The shard began to dissolve, its warmth spreading through my veins. The visions around me slowed, each one freezing in place like a paused film. One vision stood out among the rest, a version of me standing in the middle of the crater, arms raised, the glow surrounding them. It wasn't fear I saw on their face. It was acceptance. I closed my eyes and let the warmth consume me. When I opened them, I was no longer falling. I was standing at the center of the crater, the glow surrounding me. It wasn't chaotic or destructive as I had feared. It was calm, pulsating gently like a heartbeat. The hum resonated in my chest, aligning with my own heartbeat. I felt connected to it, to the fractures, to the countless versions of myself. This is the source, I said aloud, the realization washing over me. It's not a threat. It's balance. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the glow. The world exploded in light. When I woke, I was lying in the field, the crater gone. The sky was clear, the air still. I sat up, my body aching but intact. The world felt different, quieter somehow. As I looked around, I realized the fractures were gone. The chaos I had seen in the newspapers, the strange phenomena, they had all disappeared. But so had the dreams. For the first time in weeks, my mind was silent. I stood and began walking back toward town, unsure of what I would find. My memories of the event were hazy, but one thing was clear: the glow had been a part of me all along, a reflection of the choices I had made and the paths I had taken. As I reached the edge of the field, I turned back one last time. The crater was gone, but the faint hum lingered in the air, a reminder of what had been. I didn't know what the future held, but I felt a strange sense of peace. The dreams had brought me to the edge of reality and back again, and though I had changed, I was still here. And that was enough. Have you ever woken up to something so inexplicable that it made you question reality? For me, it all started with a storm. The night it happened, the wind howled like a living thing outside my small beach house. Rain pounded against the windows, and the ocean roared as if it wanted to swallow the world whole. I had seen storms before, plenty of them. Living by the coast, you grew used to their sudden ferocity. But something about this one felt different. I stayed up late, the unease gnawing at me. When the storm finally subsided in the early hours of the morning, I fell into a restless sleep. The next day, I stepped outside to survey the damage. The beach was littered with debris, branches, seaweed, and broken shells strewn across the sand. The air was crisp and damp, the kind that clings to your skin. And then I saw them. Footprints. They were faint at first, just a few scattered impressions in the wet sand. They weren't mine, I hadn't been out yet, and they didn't seem to belong to anyone else either. They were larger than an average person's, almost unnaturally so, and the pattern was off. Each step was spaced too far apart, as though whoever, or whatever, had made them was moving within human strides. I followed the tracks, curiosity outweighing the chill creeping up my spine. They led from the shoreline toward the dunes, weaving erratically before disappearing entirely near a patch of sea grass. I paused, scanning the area, but there was no one in sight. Probably some late-night wanderer, I muttered to myself, though the explanation felt hollow. As the day went on, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints. Who would be out in a storm like that? And why did the tracks end so abruptly? By evening, the beach looked almost normal again. The tide had washed away most of the debris, leaving the sand smooth and untouched. I stood by the window, sipping my coffee, and watched the waves roll in. The unease from the morning had dulled but hadn't disappeared entirely. Then I noticed them again. The footprints were back. This time, they were closer to my house, starting just beyond the edge of the dunes and leading toward my front porch. My stomach twisted as I set the mug down and grabbed a flashlight. The wind had picked up again, and the night was thick with the smell of salt and damp earth. I opened the door, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The footprints were fresh, their edges sharp against the sand. They stopped at my front steps. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The only response was the crash of the waves and the whisper of the wind through the grass. I shone the flashlight around, half expecting to see someone or something lurking nearby. But the beach was empty. Heart pounding, I backed into the house and locked the door. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the wind had played tricks with the sand, or maybe someone was out for an early walk. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the beach, waiting for the footprints to appear again. But the tide came and went, and the sand remained undisturbed. I almost convinced myself it was over. Until the next morning, when I found the footprints circling my house. When I opened the door that morning, my breath hitched in my throat. The footprints were everywhere, dozens of them, weaving a chaotic path around my house. They spiraled inward, closer and closer to the walls, as if something had been pacing outside all night, studying the place. My first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but I froze with my phone in hand. What would I say? That I'd found strange footprints? That they seemed impossible, yet somehow real? No one would believe me, and I couldn't even be sure I believed myself. Instead, I grabbed a stick from the yard and poked at one of the prints. It was deep, far too deep for a casual stroll across the sand. Whoever, or whatever, made these was heavy. The pattern was the same as before, long, unnatural strides with wide, claw-like indentations. I followed the trail as it led away from the house. My legs trembled as I walked, and the morning sun did little to dispel the chill creeping through me. The tracks went straight to the dunes before veering toward the waterline. There, they stopped again. The ocean stretched out before me, vast and indifferent. It glimmered under the sunlight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath its surface was watching. That day, I avoided the beach. I stayed inside, curtains drawn, trying to distract myself with books and television, but nothing held my attention. My thoughts kept circling back to the footprints. By nightfall, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and howling through the cracks. I paced the living room, glancing at the clock every few minutes. Midnight came and went, and I forced myself to sit by the window, staring into the darkness. And then I saw them. The footprints were back, appearing as if by magic in the beam of my flashlight. They started near the waterline and crept toward the house. This time, they were more deliberate, more focused. I watched in frozen horror as the tracks approached the porch. The steps were slow but steady, each one seeming to form out of the sand itself. A shadow flickered in the corner of my vision. I turned, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. The beach was empty, no figures, no movement. Only the relentless advance of those cursed footprints. I slammed the door shut and locked it, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to get out of there. But where would I go? This was my home, my sanctuary, and now it felt like a trap. The night dragged on, the hours stretching into an eternity. I didn't dare sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind sent my nerves into overdrive. I sat in the corner of the living room, clutching a baseball bat, staring at the door. When dawn finally broke, I ventured outside with trembling hands. The footprints were everywhere, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. But something was different. In the center of the tracks, right by my front door, was an object. It was small and dark, half buried in the sand. I crouched down to inspect it, my heart pounding in my ears. It was a weathered key. I picked it up, feeling its cold weight in my hand. It didn't match any of the locks in my house. It looked ancient, its metal pitted and corroded as if it had been lost at sea for years. A sudden gust of wind blew sand across my face, and I stumbled back, clutching the key tightly. That was when I saw the message. Scrawled in the sand, just beneath where the key had lain, were 2 words, "Come closer." I backed away, heart racing, the key biting into my palm. I didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear, this wasn't just a random series of events. Something was calling me, and it wasn't going to stop. I stared at the words etched into the sand until the wind blurred them away. My legs felt like they would buckle, but somehow I made it back into the house. I locked every door and window, as if that could keep the strangeness at bay. The key weighed heavy in my pocket. I didn't want to touch it again, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen counter, far from sight but never far from my thoughts. The day passed in a haze of unease. I couldn't eat, couldn't think straight. Every time I glanced at the windows, I half expected to see those footprints, to see something or someone standing there. That night, the storm returned, fiercer than before. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain lashed against the windows. I tried to ignore the noise, burying myself in blankets and turning up the television's volume. But then I heard it, a distinct knock at the front door. 3 sharp raps, deliberate and unhurried. My blood turned to ice. Who would be out there in this weather? I waited, hoping I'd imagined it, but the knock came again. Louder this time. I crept to the door, bat in hand, and peered through the peephole. There was no one there. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Then, against all reason, I unlocked the door and opened it. The wind nearly ripped the door from my hand, but I held firm, scanning the empty porch. The beach beyond was shrouded in darkness, and the rain made it impossible to see far. But there, at the edge of the light cast by my porch, I saw them, footprints. They weren't leading away this time. They were leading toward the house, stopping abruptly at the front door. I slammed it shut, bolting it and stepping back. My chest heaved as I struggled to control my breathing. That's when I noticed the key was gone. The counter where I'd left it was empty. My mind raced. Had I moved it without realizing? Had someone taken it? A chill ran down my spine as I noticed something else. In the corner of the room, a faint shimmer caught my eye. I turned, heart pounding, and saw the key lying on the coffee table. It hadn't been there before. I approached it cautiously, as if it might spring to life. The key looked the same, withered and ancient, but now it was dry, as though it had never been outside in the rain. Beneath it, on the table's surface, were scratch marks. Letters. Use it. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the rug. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as though mocking my fear. I grabbed the key and held it up, my fingers trembling. Use it for what? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. As if in response, the lights flickered, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the black. The scratches on the table seemed to glow faintly, like they had been burned into the wood. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't describe. I backed away from the table, my grip tightening on the key. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Behind me, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound. Footsteps. They were inside the house. I whipped around, the beam of the flashlight sweeping the room. Nothing. But the sound continued, growing louder, closer. I stumbled toward the back door, key in hand, not knowing what I was running from but desperate to escape. The door wouldn't budge, as if it had fused to the frame. The footsteps stopped. I turned slowly, the flashlight trembling in my grip. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure. It was tall and shrouded in shadows, its features indistinct. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my voice barely held steady. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised an arm and pointed at the key in my hand. "Use it," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Before I could react, the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving me alone with the storm and the key. The house felt empty, yet the weight of unseen eyes lingered at every corner. My pulse thundered in my ears as I clutched the key, its cold metal pressing against my palm. The figure's command echoed in my mind, "Use it." But how? On what? I couldn't stay in the house. Not anymore. Grabbing a raincoat, I stepped out into the storm. The rain hit me in stinging sheets, the wind nearly knocking me off balance. My flashlight's beam barely cut through the dark, but I didn't care. My feet carried me instinctively toward the beach. The sand was a chaotic mess of rippling water and shifting grains. Yet, despite the chaos, the footprints were there, clear, deliberate, leading down to the shoreline. I hesitated for a moment, then followed them. Each step felt heavier, as though the sand were trying to pull me under. The wind carried strange whispers, almost like voices, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The footprint stopped abruptly at a patch of sand darker than the rest, as if it had been scorched. I crouched, brushing the wet grains away. My hands froze when I saw it, a rusted metal hatch embedded in the earth. It was circular, with no visible handle, only a keyhole at its center. Around the edge were strange symbols, etched deep into the surface. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, jagged and alien, yet they felt disturbingly familiar. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadowy figure behind me, but there was only the empty stretch of beach. The storm seemed to quiet, as if the world were holding its breath. My hand trembled as I raised the key. It slid into the lock with an eerie smoothness, fitting perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, grinding sound, the hatch began to turn on its own. The sand around it shifted and fell away, revealing a dark, gaping hole beneath. A ladder descended into the void, its metal rung slick with moisture. A wave of nausea rolled over me. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run back to the safety of my home. But something stronger held me in place, a pull, a need to know what lay beneath. I descended the ladder, my breath shallow and quick. The air grew colder with each step, the sound of the storm above fading into silence. The space below smelled of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. The ladder ended in a narrow tunnel, its walls lined with the same strange symbols as the hatch. The flashlight's beam revealed that the path stretched on, curving slightly out of sight. As I stepped forward, the walls seemed to pulse faintly, almost as if they were alive. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound stretching and distorting. The tunnel opened into a cavern. At its center stood a pedestal, and on it lay an object covered by a black cloth. The air felt charged, vibrating with an energy I couldn't explain. I approached slowly, the hair on my arms standing on end. The whispers from the beach returned, louder now, overlapping and unintelligible. My fingers hesitated before gripping the cloth. With a single motion, I pulled it away. What lay beneath defied comprehension. It was a sphere, glowing faintly, its surface shifting like liquid. Within it, shapes moved, indistinct but familiar. Faces, landscapes, events. It was as if the sphere held the memories of the world. I reached out, compelled to touch it. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, a jolt of electricity surged through me. My vision blurred, and suddenly, I was somewhere else. I saw the storm, the beach, the house, everything, but twisted. The house was engulfed in flames, the beach littered with bodies, the sky a swirling vortex of black and red. And then I saw them, the figures. Dozens of them, standing motionless, their faces blank and featureless. They turned toward me in unison, and one stepped forward, reaching out a hand. I yanked my hand away from the sphere, gasping for breath. The cavern was silent again, but the sphere's glow had dimmed, as if it had taken something from me. The whispers returned, louder now, almost angry. I stumbled back toward the ladder, the sphere's vision burned into my mind. I climbed as fast as I could, emerging onto the beach just as the first rays of dawn broke through the storm clouds. The world looked normal again, but I knew it wasn't. The key was gone, the hatch sealed once more. But the footprints were still there, leading back to the house. And when I turned, I saw them, 3 figures standing at the edge of the waves, watching me. I stood frozen, the figures unmoving at the edge of the water. They were too far away to make out their faces, but their stillness was unnerving. The light of dawn seemed to highlight them unnaturally, as if the world refused to acknowledge their presence. For a moment, I thought I could walk away. Pretend I hadn't seen them. Pretend none of this was real. But then, as if sensing my thoughts, the figures began to move slowly, deliberately, toward me. The rational part of me screamed to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt rooted in place, my legs heavy as stone. One of the figures broke away from the group, walking ahead of the others. It stopped a few feet from me, close enough that I should have been able to see its face. But there was nothing, just a blank expanse where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Why me? The words left my lips before I realized I had spoken. My voice sounded small, almost childlike, against the roaring of the waves. The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, I heard its answer. You opened the door. A wave of nausea rolled through me. My mind flashed back to the hatch, the sphere, the vision of destruction. Was this my fault? Had I brought this upon myself? The other two figures reached us, flanking the first like silent sentinels. Their presence felt heavier now, the air around them pressing against my chest. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The first figure raised its hand, pointing past me. I turned slowly, following its gesture. The footprints. They were back, but they weren't leading to the house anymore. They curved away, heading toward the cliffs at the far end of the beach. The figures didn't speak again. They simply waited, their blank faces turned toward me expectantly. I understood the unspoken command, follow the path. My heart pounded as I began to walk, the sound of the ocean fading into an unnatural silence. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged and imposing. The footprints stopped at the edge, disappearing into the void below. I peered over the edge, half expecting to see another hatch or some otherworldly clue. Instead, I saw a sheer drop into churning, black water. I turned back to the figures, but they were gone. The realization hit me like a blow. I was alone. Whatever was happening, whatever nightmare I'd stumbled into, I had to face it on my own. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see them trembling. But they weren't. Instead, my fingers were coated in sand, black, damp sand that I hadn't touched since leaving the hatch. And then I felt it, a vibration under my feet, faint but growing stronger. The ground beneath me began to shift, the cliff crumbling away as if something massive was moving beneath the surface. I stumbled back, but it was too late. The earth gave way, and I fell, the roar of the collapsing cliff drowning out my screams. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Then, I hit the water. The cold was a shock, stealing the air from my lungs. I thrashed, struggling to find the surface, but the current was too strong. It dragged me down, deeper and deeper, until the light above was just a faint glimmer. And then I saw it. In the depths, something moved, huge, serpentine, its glowing eyes locking onto me. The sphere's vision returned to my mind, clearer than ever. The destruction. The figures. The flames. It wasn't a vision. It was a warning. I kicked hard, desperate to escape the creature's gaze. My lungs burned, my strength fading. Just as I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, a hand grabbed mine, pulling me upward. I broke the surface, gasping for air. The storm was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. When I looked around, I saw the beach in the distance, untouched and pristine. The house stood as if nothing had happened. But when I turned to thank my savior, no one was there. The figures were gone. The sphere, the hatch, everything. But as I stumbled back onto the sand, I knew the nightmare wasn't over. Because the footprints were still there. And they were leading back to my house. What would you do if the last thing you heard from a friend was a plea for help, but no one else could hear it? It was a little past midnight when my phone buzzed. I was half asleep, the dull glow of the screen casting shadows on the walls. The notification read, "Message from Ethan. I just got the last call. It's here." The words sent a jolt through me. Ethan wasn't the type to send cryptic messages. He was steady, rational, and accountant, for crying out loud. I texted him back immediately. "What are you talking about? Are you okay?" No response. I dialed his number, my heart racing as the ringtone echoed in my ear. 1 ring. 2. 3. And then silence. At first, I thought he had picked up, but there was no greeting, no sound of breathing. Just a static hum, faint but persistent, like the sound of an old TV left on in an empty room. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice trembling. No reply. I strained to listen, my pulse pounding in my ears. Was that whispering? Faint, fragmented voices seemed to drift through the static, too soft to make out but unmistakably human. "Ethan, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," I said, trying to mask the fear creeping into my voice. The whispering grew louder, overlapping into a dissonant murmur. My grip on the phone tightened. And then, cutting through the noise, I heard it, a single, clear sentence. "Don't let it in." The call disconnected. I sat there in stunned silence, staring at the phone as if it might explain itself. My apartment felt too quiet now, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and groan of the building. I tried calling Ethan again, but it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I tossed the phone onto the couch and rubbed my temples. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe. A sudden knock at the door made me jump. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was too late for visitors, and I lived alone. The knock came again, louder this time. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to ignore it. But curiosity won out. I approached the door, my footsteps feeling heavier with each step. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice barely steady. No answer. The peephole revealed nothing but darkness, as if someone had covered it from the outside. My phone buzzed again. I nearly dropped it in my haste to check the screen. New message from Ethan. "Don't open the door." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, insistent now, almost frantic. "Ethan?" I called out, but I knew it wasn't him. The phone buzzed once more. "Ethan, it's not me." The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on me from all sides. My hand hovered over the doorknob, torn between the urge to confront whatever, or whoever, was out there and the overwhelming dread pooling in my stomach. The knocking stopped. For a brief moment, I thought it was over. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard it. My voice. "Let me in." I stood there, frozen, staring at the door. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud I could hear it ringing in my ears. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened. The voice had been mine. There was no mistaking it. But how? How was that possible? I hadn't spoken. I hadn't even moved. It was like something was using my voice to mimic me. "Let me in," it repeated, but this time it was a low, strained whisper, too familiar and yet entirely wrong. I felt it crawl under my skin, sending a shiver down my spine. "Ethan?" I called, my voice shaking, but the only answer was the soft sound of the wind outside, gently rustling the trees. I quickly stepped back from the door. The walls felt as if they were closing in on me, suffocating me with their oppressive silence. I ran my fingers over my phone again, desperate to call Ethan, to hear his voice, to make sense of what was happening. But as I unlocked the screen, I noticed something odd. There was a new message from Ethan. "Ethan, they're here. They're watching you. Get out." My hands trembled as I stared at the words. What was he trying to tell me? Watching me? Who? I tried to call him again, but the phone rang endlessly, the static starting to creep in once more, like it was mocking my growing panic. The whispering started again, barely audible at first. I looked at the door. The sound came from the other side, growing louder with each passing second. Voices, many voices, murmuring in low tones, speaking words I couldn't understand. The air felt thick now, as though the very space around me was alive, pressing in on all sides. Without thinking, I dropped the phone on the couch and rushed to the windows. I tore back the heavy curtains, my heart in my throat, fearing what I might see. But there was nothing, only the dark outline of the street and the faint glow of distant streetlights. Nothing out of the ordinary. Except something in the corner of my eye caught my attention. A shadow. It was far down the street, close to where the woods began. It moved unnaturally, too quickly to be a person, a black, shapeless figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. My blood ran cold. I jerked away from the window and stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to get out of here. Whatever was happening, it was no longer just a strange message. It was real. The door, the knocking, it wasn't just a prank. It wasn't a mistake. The knocking came again, louder this time, as if it had moved closer. I spun around. The door, how had it gotten so close? I hadn't heard anyone move. Yet there it was, just inches from my face, its weight pressing in as though it were alive, demanding entry. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, now a raspy, guttural tone. The same voice, but twisted. Deeper. I couldn't take it anymore. My mind screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't let them in, I couldn't. Suddenly, the door crashed open so violently that I staggered backward, falling to the ground. I looked up, my eyes wide in terror. The figure stood there in the doorway. Tall, almost impossibly tall, with its face obscured by shadows. The features were barely there, just the outline of a human form, yet nothing about it felt human. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest, unable to tear my eyes away. It stepped inside. I scrambled backward, my hands hitting the cold hardwood floor. My breath came in ragged gasps as the figure loomed closer, its footsteps muffled as it crossed the threshold. It was silent, as if it were floating, moving without making a sound. My body refused to respond, paralyzed by a combination of fear and disbelief. The room around me seemed to shrink, the shadows in every corner seeming to stretch toward the figure, almost as if they were alive, crawling toward it. Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. It didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand slowly, and I saw it clearly for the first time, a pale, gaunt hand, its skin stretched too tight over the bones. It was nothing like a human's, not in any way I had ever seen before. The fingers were long, too long, like the tendrils of something that shouldn't exist. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. My phone. I needed to call for help. I reached out for it, but before I could touch it, the figure's hand shot out, a blur of movement that made my skin crawl. It snatched the phone away in one swift motion, its fingers curling around it with unnatural force. "Give that back," I shouted, panic rising. But it didn't respond. Instead, the figure tilted its head as if studying me, its shadowy face still hidden. It didn't speak, but the air around me grew heavier, denser, like the very atmosphere was pushing against me. I tried to stand, my legs unsteady, but the floor beneath me seemed to shift. I staggered, caught off guard, and then I heard it, the faintest sound, like a low hum, vibrating from the walls themselves. It wasn't coming from the figure, no, it was coming from everywhere, from the walls, from the very air around me. The hum grew louder. It was a constant buzz, like the sound of 1,000 voices murmuring, all at once. And then, just like that, it shifted into words, unintelligible at first, but then unmistakable. You shouldn't have answered. My blood ran cold. That voice. That was the voice from the phone call, the one I had heard before. But it wasn't Ethan's. It was deep, distorted, echoing through the room. Before I could react, the figure stepped closer, placing its other hand on the floor. The touch left a trail of frost behind it, as if the warmth of the room was being drained away. The temperature in the house plummeted, my breath now visible in the freezing air. The shadows seemed to expand with the cold, creeping along the walls, the corners, until the whole room was suffocating in darkness. I couldn't breathe. The weight in the room was unbearable, and I felt as though I was sinking, falling into a black void. The figure loomed over me, its presence consuming everything. And then it spoke again, its voice coming from every direction, seeping into my mind. You've opened the door. You've let us in. The room seemed to close in, the hum growing louder, unbearable now. I had no choice but to act. My eyes darted around, desperate for anything to defend myself. I spotted the chair beside me, the only thing within reach. I grabbed it, the wood slipping through my cold fingers, and swung it at the figure. It went right through it. The chair passed through its form as though it were made of smoke, offering no resistance. I froze, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. The figure was no longer solid. It was like a distortion in reality itself, a presence too large for this space, folding and unfolding in impossible ways. The figure reached out again, its hand wrapping around my throat before I could react. I tried to scream, but no sound came. It squeezed harder, and the air in my lungs burned. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, everything stopped. The room snapped back into focus. The shadows retreated. The cold lifted. The figure was gone. I gasped, sucking in air, my hands instinctively clutching my throat. I was alone. The room was still. I didn't know how much time had passed. A minute? An hour? It felt like an eternity. I shakily picked up the phone from where the figure had left it. The screen was cracked. The message from Ethan was still there, but something was different. The words had changed. Ethan, it's not me. Don't trust the calls. Don't pick up. I couldn't bring myself to move. I stared at the screen, the words blurring in front of my eyes. It's not me. Don't trust the calls. The message felt like a warning, but I didn't know who or what I was being warned against. The phone was still warm in my hand, but my heart was pounding in my chest like a drumbeat, drowning out everything else. I needed to think. I needed to do something. My eyes flickered to the door, where the figure had stood just moments ago. The silence was deafening. The room felt suffocating in its stillness, as if the air itself were waiting for something. The shadows in the corners stretched like fingers, reaching toward me, and the cold returned, creeping up my spine like ice. I jumped to my feet, moving instinctively toward the front door. But before I could even touch the handle, my phone buzzed again. My heart skipped. It was another message. From Ethan. Ethan, you're not alone. The phone calls, they're just the beginning. They can hear you. They know everything about you. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, and it clattered against the floor, the screen flickering briefly before going dark. My pulse raced in my ears as I tried to steady myself. The room seemed to spin. I had to get out of here. I couldn't stay another second. I grabbed my coat and rushed to the door, flinging it open. The outside air hit me like a slap, cold and sharp against my skin. But there was nothing, no one. The street was empty, just the usual shadows and the hum of distant traffic. The world outside was calm, as it always had been. But it didn't feel normal anymore. Nothing felt normal. I glanced over my shoulder at the house, and that's when I saw it. The door was still wide open. The same eerie feeling flooded my veins, and I took a hesitant step back toward it. Something was wrong. Something was inside. I didn't want to go back. But I had no choice. My body moved before my mind could fully process the thought, pulling me toward the door like an invisible force was dragging me back inside. When I stepped across the threshold, the temperature dropped again. The shadows in the hall twisted unnaturally. It was as though the house itself was changing, warping. You shouldn't have come back. The voice was clear this time, not through the phone but through the air itself. It was deep and raspy, like the whisper of someone who had been buried alive for too long. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place as the voice seemed to come from every corner of the room. I tried to move, to run, but my legs were like lead. The floor creaked behind me, and I turned slowly. There, at the far end of the hallway, I saw it again, the figure. Its shape was darker than the shadows themselves, more formless and menacing. Its hand reached out, fingers stretching like they were made of the darkness itself, curling toward me. The air grew heavier. The oppressive hum returned, vibrating the walls as the figure started to move, its footfalls silent, yet somehow louder than the storm in my chest. I backed away slowly, my mind scrambling for a way out, for any way to escape. But the figure was closing in. I could hear it now, breathing, a low and gurgling sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was coming closer, too close. Its presence was like a weight on my chest, squeezing the life out of me. I had to act. Desperation surged through me as I grabbed the nearest object within reach, a small table lamp. With shaking hands, I swung it toward the figure, desperate to push it back. The lamp collided with the figure's form, but it passed through as if the figure weren't there at all. A cold, mocking laugh filled the air, and the figure's voice hissed, "You think you can stop it?" In that instant, the room went black. The darkness enveloped me, thick and suffocating. My heart raced, and I could feel the blood pounding in my ears. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to see. It was as though the world had been swallowed whole by this black void. The laughter from the figure echoed through the blackness, the sound reverberating like it was inside my head, making my stomach churn. And then, there was a sound. A single ring, faint at first, like the sound of an old telephone. It grew louder, sharper, and soon it was all I could hear. The phone. My phone. The one that had started all of this. I reached for it instinctively, my hand groping through the thick blackness, until my fingers brushed the cold plastic. The familiar hum of the phone seemed to calm me, if only for a moment. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. It wasn't a message. It was a call. From Ethan. I stared at the screen, paralyzed by fear. The call was coming from Ethan's number, but something was wrong. The number was dim, flickering like a glitch. And the image beside it, the one that was supposed to be his face, was just a dark, swirling mass, like a shadow that refused to take shape. I should have hung up. I should have thrown the phone away, walked out of the house, and never looked back. But I couldn't. My hand moved on its own, bringing the phone to my ear. The call connected with a sharp click, and then the voice came through. "You shouldn't have answered." It was Ethan's voice, or at least it sounded like him. But it was wrong. There was something off, something distorted about it, like the words were being twisted as they left his mouth. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was tight, constricted by fear. The voice on the other end continued. "The phone calls aren't just warnings anymore. They're a bridge." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The voice was cold, unnatural, and it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was like I wasn't speaking to Ethan at all, but something else, something that used his voice, used his number, but wasn't him. I managed to force out a single word, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" "They know you," the voice replied, its tone thick with something I couldn't place. "They know everything about you. The calls, the messages, they're not from the living. They're from beyond the veil." The phone crackled, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else, scratching, dragging sounds, like something was moving behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty, just the same empty darkness that surrounded me. "You opened the door when you answered the first call," the voice continued. "Now they're coming. They can feel you. They're already inside." My breath caught in my chest, my pulse hammering as the words sank in. The room around me felt smaller, closing in like a vice. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I held the phone to my ear, the sound of Ethan's voice turning more guttural, more frantic. "They're here." Suddenly, the phone line went dead. The silence was deafening, and the connection was lost. But the pressure, the suffocating weight in the room, didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. I dropped the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably, and looked around the room. The shadows had grown darker, more solid. They twisted, reaching for me, pulling at the corners of the walls like something was trying to break through. And then I heard it. The faintest of sounds, a distant ringing, like a phone ringing in another room. But it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere beyond the room itself. The ringing grew louder, sharper. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around in panic, trying to make sense of what was happening. The shadows in the corners of the room shifted again, this time more quickly, moving in unnatural patterns, swirling like smoke. And then, just as quickly, everything stopped. The ringing ceased. The shadows retreated. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But the air felt heavier, thicker now, as if something unseen was waiting, watching. I turned to leave, but my feet felt heavy, like the floor itself was trying to hold me in place. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It wasn't the same as before. This one was more defined, more real, and it was moving toward me. I didn't wait for it to come closer. I ran. It started one quiet evening, the kind where the air feels thick with silence and the world outside feels distant. I was sitting alone in my living room, the glow of the lamp casting a warm light across the space, making everything seem comfortable, familiar. But the peace didn't last long. At first, it was nothing more than a faint whisper, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. But then, it became clearer, like a voice calling from the depths of the room. I froze. "What do you see?" It was an odd question, a simple one, but it was enough to make my skin prickle. I glanced around the room, half expecting someone to be standing there, but there was nothing. The silence returned, heavier this time. My heart thudded in my chest as I tried to shake the unease that had settled over me. My mind raced. Who was asking this? Was someone in the house? I wasn't sure if I should answer, but the question hung in the air, thick and insistent. What do you see? The voice repeated, louder this time, clearer. It wasn't a scream, not a shout, but a demand that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I swallowed hard, my breath shaky. What did I see? The living room. The chair. The table. The dim light from the lamp flickering slightly as though the room itself was reacting to the presence of something unseen. I see my living room, I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The moment the words left my lips, the air around me seemed to shift. The room, which had felt so familiar just moments before, now felt wrong. The walls seemed to pulse, the shadows beneath the furniture darker than before. It was like the room was slowly bending, shifting in ways that made no sense. But it was subtle. Too subtle. It was as if the room was playing tricks on me, making my mind doubt its own senses. The lamp's light flickered again, casting long, thin shadows that stretched out unnaturally, creeping across the floor toward me. What else do you see? The voice asked again, more insistent this time, as though it were pushing me to acknowledge something more. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away from the shadows. There was something wrong, something that wasn't there before. But I wasn't sure if I was imagining it. I see the shadows, I said hesitantly, my words trembling in the air. They're moving. A long silence followed, and I held my breath, waiting for the voice to speak again. The shadows stopped, as if they had heard my words. I didn't know if that was worse, if it was just a trick of my mind or something more. And then, just when I thought I could finally relax, the voice came again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same calm, cold tone. This time, it was louder. It was filled with urgency, with a growing demand. Tell me, what do you see? I felt a pang of panic rising in my chest. Something had changed. The room seemed to contract around me, as if the walls were closing in, squeezing the air from my lungs. The voice wasn't just asking anymore, it was commanding, as if it knew something I didn't. As if it was watching me, waiting for me to say the wrong thing. I see the shadows, I repeated, almost too afraid to say anything else. I see a figure. The moment I spoke the words, the temperature in the room dropped. I could feel the chill on the back of my neck, like a cold hand running up my spine. The figure in the shadows, it wasn't just a shape anymore. It was moving. It was getting closer. My heart raced. I wanted to move, to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The figure came closer, slowly, methodically, its outline barely visible in the shifting darkness. I tried to force myself to look away, but my eyes refused to leave the spot. And then, the voice spoke again, softer this time, like a murmur just behind my ear. What do you see now? I didn't have an answer. The room felt suffocating now, as if the very air around me was thickening with each passing second. The voice wasn't gone, it lingered like a shadow, always there, always waiting. I could still hear it, low and persistent, like a whisper that traveled through my thoughts. The figure in the corner hadn't moved, but I could sense it. It was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. I should have turned on the lights, or run, or screamed, but instead, I stood frozen. My mind kept replaying the question over and over, as though it had etched itself into the very fabric of the room. "What do you see now?" it asked again, but this time the voice felt wrong. It wasn't just demanding, it felt mocking. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the next. The air seemed to grow heavier, and the walls around me felt like they were closing in, suffocating me slowly, deliberately. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch longer, their shapes growing more distinct. There was something in the darkness that wasn't just a trick of the light. The figure wasn't just a shadow anymore, it had depth. I could almost make out its features now, the outline of something large and looming, its presence more real than the walls of my own house. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. I couldn't move. "What do you see now?" The voice again, closer this time, like it was standing right next to me. I could almost feel the breath of it, cold and unsettling. The shadows crept closer, and I finally managed to tear my eyes away, blinking in a desperate attempt to clear my mind. But when I looked back, the figure wasn't just in the corner anymore, it was closer. Much closer. It was standing by the door now, its form shifting in the dim light, like something that couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. I see it. "I see you," I whispered, my voice shaky and filled with fear. "I see you, standing by the door." The temperature in the room dropped, and I felt the chill seep into my bones. The figure didn't move, not at first, but I could feel it. It was there. It was waiting. And somehow, I knew it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It had been here all along, watching, listening, waiting for me to say the right words. I couldn't breathe. "What do you see now?" The voice repeated again, louder this time, as if it was becoming impatient with my hesitation. The mocking tone was gone, replaced with something darker, something sinister. I stared at the door. The handle had begun to turn on its own, slowly, deliberately. It creaked as if a hand had gripped it from the other side, twisting it just enough to make the door inch open. The darkness beyond the door seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing. "No. I see nothing." "I don't see anything anymore," I said, my words a desperate attempt to deny the reality that was unfolding in front of me. But it was too late. The door swung open completely, and the air in the room turned icy cold. I could feel the temperature drop so rapidly that my breath came out in visible puffs, like vapor. I didn't want to look, but my body refused to obey. My eyes were drawn to the opening door, to the darkness beyond it, and what I saw there nearly made me collapse. There was someone standing in the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its shape an indistinct blur in the blackness. It wasn't human, not really. I could see its eyes, two dark, empty pits staring back at me, and I felt as though I were being pulled into them, trapped in a gaze that was both foreign and familiar. And then, the voice came again, but this time it wasn't coming from the room. It was coming from everywhere. "What do you see now?" I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me began to warp, to shift. The room seemed to stretch, elongating, twisting into something else. The familiar walls faded away, replaced by the dark hallway. The shadows, no longer just shadows, had become solid. They reached out toward me, their tendrils curling around the edges of the room, pulling the world closer, folding it in on itself. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening? Was this real? Could it be real? The voice wasn't waiting anymore. It had become a force, pressing on me, demanding, "What do you see now?" It wasn't a question, it was an order. And I knew then, in that moment, that if I answered again, if I even spoke, the world would change once more. And I would have no way of stopping it. But even knowing this, I couldn't stop myself. The words were already on the tip of my tongue, and I couldn't hold them back. I see darkness, I whispered, barely able to form the words, the room now completely swallowed by the void. And with that, everything went silent. The voice was gone. The figure was gone. The room was empty, still. But I knew something had shifted, something had changed, and I wasn't sure if I had any control over what came next. The silence hung in the air like a thick fog, pressing down on me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the questions weren't over yet. For a moment, the silence was almost a relief. The oppressive weight of the voice, the presence that seemed to consume everything around me, faded into a distant echo. I was left in the stillness of the room, my breath shallow and uneven, my body trembling with the remnants of fear. The walls, once heavy with the weight of dark shadows, now felt empty, as if they were nothing more than a hollow shell. But I knew better than to think it was over. There was something in the air, something I couldn't shake, couldn't escape. The feeling of being watched, of being pulled deeper into something I didn't understand. I stood frozen, my mind spinning in circles, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no answers came. Only more questions. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, a hallucination brought on by stress, fatigue. But the coldness in the room, the strange sensation in my bones, told me otherwise. This was no dream. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, I heard it again. The voice. "What do you see now?" It was different this time. It wasn't just a question, it was a command. The voice was no longer merely in my mind. It felt as if it had slipped into the room itself, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating fog. It pressed in on me, invading my every thought, every breath. I couldn't ignore it. My mouth moved before I could stop myself, my voice barely above a whisper, but the words came nonetheless. "I see nothing," I said, my voice cracking with fear. The room grew darker. The edges of my vision blurred, and the familiar walls seemed to dissolve into shadows. The darkness crept in around me like a living thing, crawling toward me, swallowing the light. I could no longer see the door, the furniture, the windows. There was only darkness. But it didn't stop there. The air grew thick with the sound of breathing, slow, uneven breaths that didn't belong to me. The room wasn't just darkening. It was alive, pulsing with something I couldn't understand. The walls seemed to close in on me, pressing against me as if trying to crush me, to force me into the darkness. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, through the suffocating blackness, I saw it, a flicker of light, barely perceptible, like a candle flame in the distance. But when I looked closer, I realized it wasn't a flame. It was a figure. It stood there, unmoving, just beyond my reach. A silhouette in the dark, its shape indistinct, like a person, but not a person. The edges of its form shimmered, warped, as if it were made of smoke or shadow. The longer I stared, the more the figure seemed to shift, its outline becoming clearer, more defined. It wasn't human. It had no face, no features, just a dark void where its face should be. "What do you see now?" The voice was louder this time, more insistent. It reverberated in my skull, rattling my bones, shaking my sanity. The figure in the darkness moved, slowly at first, then faster, its limbs jerking in unnatural motions like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted. My legs felt weak, as if the very ground beneath me was giving way. What do you see now? The figure was getting closer, its form warping and twisting as it advanced toward me. Each step it took seemed to stretch time itself, each movement dragging me deeper into the darkness. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't escape. The voice had its hold on me, and I was powerless to break free. I see, I gasped, my voice barely audible. I see you. The figure stopped moving, and for a moment, everything was still. The room, the darkness, the voice, all of it paused, holding its breath. And then, with a suddenness that made my heart skip a beat, the figure lunged. It was faster than I could comprehend, its limbs reaching for me with an inhuman speed. I barely had time to react, stumbling backward, but the darkness was closing in around me, pressing me forward, pulling me closer to that thing that wasn't human. What do you see now? I screamed, the sound finally breaking free from my throat, but it was drowned out by the deafening roar of the voice. The figure was on me now, its cold, shadowy hands grabbing for me, its shape contorting as if it were trying to become something else, something worse. I felt its cold touch on my arm, and in that instant, I knew this wasn't a dream. This wasn't just a voice. This was real. The darkness, the figure, the voice, they were all part of something bigger, something I couldn't understand. And it was too late to stop it. In a blind panic, I pulled away, scrambling for the door, for any escape. But the door was gone. The room, the house, it was gone. There was no way out. Just darkness, and the voice. What do you see now? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was trapped, caught in the web of whatever this was, with no way to break free. And then, the darkness swallowed me whole. I don't know how much time passed after the darkness consumed me. It could have been moments or hours, it all blurred together, as if time itself had no meaning here. I was lost in the void, suspended in a place that felt like nothing and everything at once. The oppressive weight of silence hung heavy in the air, thicker than the darkness that surrounded me. My breathing was the only sound I could hear, shallow and ragged. But I wasn't alone. The voice returned, softer now, more insistent, its presence filling the space around me like a thick fog. What do you see now? I tried to scream, to fight back, but nothing happened. My voice was gone, drowned by the vast emptiness. I reached out in the dark, my hands groping for something, anything to ground me, but all I touched was air. Cold, empty air. What do you see now? The question echoed in my mind, pulling at me, demanding an answer. The voice wasn't just a voice anymore, it was part of the darkness, part of this strange, otherworldly place I had found myself in. I could feel it, wrapping around my thoughts, twisting them, forcing me to respond. I don't know, I whispered, my words barely audible in the silence. There was a pause, and then the voice spoke again, its tone colder, more menacing. You must answer. You must see. I shuddered, the fear creeping back into my bones. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this a nightmare? A hallucination? But it didn't feel like any dream I had ever had. This was real. It had to be. I didn't know how to respond, how to answer it. What did it want from me? What was I supposed to see? I tried to focus, to look into the darkness, to find anything that could make sense of this. And then, slowly, I began to see it. At first, it was just a flicker, like a shadow moving in the periphery of my vision. But then it grew clearer, more distinct. Shapes, figures, outlines began to form in the darkness, twisting and shifting like reflections in a broken mirror. I saw people, or at least, what used to be people. Their faces were blurred, distorted, their features melting into one another like something out of a fevered nightmare. They moved around me, whispering in voices I couldn't understand, their bodies bending and twisting in unnatural ways. "What do you see now?" I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, and a wave of nausea swept over me. I wanted to turn away, to shut my eyes, to escape from this nightmare, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away. I was trapped in this place, surrounded by these distorted figures that seemed to grow in number with each passing moment. I staggered backward, my feet unsteady beneath me, and I finally saw it, a figure in the center of the room. It stood apart from the others, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Unlike the others, its form was clear, defined. A man, tall, with dark hair and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. His face was expressionless, but there was something about him that felt wrong. "What do you see now?" the voice repeated, now deeper, more resonant, as if it was coming from everywhere at once. I couldn't look away from the man. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt as though I was being pulled toward him, as though my very soul was being drawn in by the force of his gaze. I tried to speak, to ask him what was happening, but no words came out. My mouth was dry, my tongue heavy. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. I was paralyzed. "Answer me," the voice thundered, and the ground beneath me trembled as if the very space itself was about to shatter. "I see you," I gasped, my voice trembling with terror. The man didn't move. His eyes remained locked on mine, unblinking, unfeeling. But the moment I spoke those words, the air around me shifted. The figures in the room began to move more rapidly, their forms blurring together, like shadows merging into one. The noise of their whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, drowning out everything else. The man took a step forward, his eyes never leaving me. The closer he got, the colder the air became, and I could feel the temperature drop, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My heart raced, and my pulse hammered in my ears. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to escape. Then, as he reached out toward me, everything changed. The darkness shattered, splintering like glass, and for a moment, I was back in my room. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the weight of the darkness lifted. But the relief was short-lived. I looked around, disoriented, trying to understand what had just happened. The room was the same, but everything felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like a storm was brewing. The walls seemed to press in closer, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, deeper. And then I heard it again. "What do you see now?" The voice was no longer distant. It was here, inside my head, echoing through every fiber of my being. It wasn't just asking anymore, it was demanding. And this time, the darkness wasn't just around me. It was inside me. I had answered the question once, but I wasn't sure I could survive answering it again. I tried to steady my breath, my hands trembling as I gripped the edges of the bed. The voice was so close now, so insistent. I could almost feel it vibrating through my skull, like a living presence inside my mind. There was no escaping it, no running from it. "What do you see now?" The room, The world around me was changing, twisting. The walls were warping, the shadows stretching unnaturally toward me. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, like someone or something was just behind me. But when I turned around, nothing was there. "What do you see now?" The voice was louder, almost a growl now. It was no longer a simple question. It felt like a command, a demand for something I couldn't understand. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it only grew stronger, more persistent. My body was shaking from the inside out, my mind teetering on the edge of breaking. I couldn't think straight. I was suffocating in the weight of it, drowning in the questions, the answers that were slipping away from me. How much longer could I keep this up? How long before the darkness consumed me entirely? I opened my eyes, half expecting the man, the figure from the void, to be standing right in front of me. But there was nothing. Just the familiar, too familiar walls of my room. The same room that had been my prison for so long. "What do you see now?" The voice was no longer coming from outside, it was inside, echoing inside my skull, crawling under my skin. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. I couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the endless questioning, the weight of it all, it was too much. I closed my eyes again, this time with purpose. I wasn't going to give in. I wasn't going to answer. I refused to. But as I stood there in the silence, I felt it again, the cold air creeping in, the shadows in the corners of the room growing darker. There was something in the stillness, something watching me. Waiting. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered. "What do you see now?" And in that moment, I understood. I saw it all, more than I had ever seen before. I saw the truth. I saw the darkness that had been creeping inside me all along, slowly overtaking my thoughts, my fears. I saw the way it had been shaping my world, warping reality, twisting it into something unrecognizable. I saw the man, the figure who had been watching me from the void, from the darkness. He wasn't just a stranger. He was me. A version of me I had never wanted to face. "You see it now," the voice said, softer this time, almost satisfied. "Now you understand." I wanted to scream, to fight back, to run. But it was too late. The darkness had already taken root. It wasn't just a part of me anymore. It was me. "What do you see now?" the voice asked again, but this time I didn't need to answer. The question wasn't for me anymore. It was for the one who had become part of me. The darkness had won. And as the last remnants of light faded from my vision, I realized I had become the voice. I was the one asking the questions now. And there was no one left to answer. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.